In the town of Millhaven, where the river bent twice before it reached the mill, there lived a cooper named Thaddeus Merrick. He was not a man anyone would have pointed to and called remarkable. He wore the same canvas apron 6 days a week, scarred by decades of draw knives and hot iron hoops. He smelled, always, of white oak shavings and char smoke. His hands were thick and cracked, and his back had grown permanently curved from bending over barrels since he was 14 years old. Thaddeus made barrels for the distillery on the edge of town, the same distillery his father had supplied, and his father before him. He charred the insides of white oak staves until they blackened and cracked like a dry riverbed, because he had learned, the way all coopers learn, that the char was not damage. The char was where the flavor lived. A barrel with no char was just a box. It was the burning. His shop sat at the end of Foundry Street, a low building of grey stone with a tin roof that rang like a bell whenever hail passed through Millhaven. Inside, the air was thick with the sweet smell of steaming oak, and the low hiss of the cooper's fire kept burning from before dawn until well after the supper bell rang at the church across the square. Visitors sometimes wandered in from the road, drawn by the rhythmic knock of mallet and hoop driver, and Thaddeus would let them watch as long as they liked, so long as they did not touch the fire. Done right and left alone, 'twas the summer of 1968 when old Ezra Coleman, the man who had trained Thaddeus in the trade, sat him down after a long day of hooping barrels and said something that had nothing to do with wood at all. That turned raw spirit into something worth waiting for. Ezra had saved every spare dollar of his cooper's wages for 30 years, and instead of burying it in a coffee tin or lending it to cousins who never paid it back, he had put it into a simple fund that owned a small piece of nearly every growing company in America. He did not trade it. He did not check on it more than once a year. He treated it, he said, exactly like a barrel. You do not open a barrel every week to see if the whiskey is ready. You char it once, you seal it, and you let time and patience do work that no man's hurrying ever could. Thaddeus was 26 years old and skeptical. He had exactly $40 saved from a life of hard, honest labor, and $40 did not feel like the beginning of anything. But Ezra told him something he never forgot. He said the market would try his patience the way Greenwood tries a cooper's arm. It would crack. It would seem to fail. And every single time, if a man did not panic, if he simply left the barrel sealed and let the years do their slow work. What came out there? Thaddeus opened his first account with that $40 and a promise to himself that he would add to it every month for the rest of his working life, rain or shine. Whether the newspapers were shouting good news or bad, the other end was worth more than what went in. Thaddeus opened his first account with that $40 and a promise to himself that he would add to it every month for the rest of his working life, rain or shine. Whether the newspapers were shouting good news or bad, he kept that promise for 51 years. There was no ceremony to it, no framed certificate, no toast at the tavern, just the first Friday of every month, after the week's invoices were settled and the shop swept clean, Thaddeus would walk the 4 blocks to the little bank on Commerce Street, deposit slip folded in his shirt pocket, and add whatever he could spare to that same account Ezra had shown him how to open. Some months it was only a few dollars, when orders were slow and the price of good white oak had climbed again. Other months, when the distillery placed a large order ahead of a holiday, it was a great deal more. But the amount mattered less than the walking. Thaddeus came to think of that 4-block walk as its own kind of char, a small repeated discipline that did its work quietly, the same way fire did its work inside a sealed barrel, out of sight and impossible to rush. He was 39 years old, hooping a rush order of barrels for a bourbon house that had just doubled its export orders, when the radio in his shop crackled with news of a single day in October of 1987 when the stock market fell further and faster than it had in living memory. Grown men at the feed store were saying their savings had been cut in half. Thaddeus went home that night, looked at the number on his statement, and felt his stomach drop the way it did the first time a barrel burst under pressure in his hands. But he remembered Ezra's char. He remembered that damage on the surface was sometimes exactly how the deep, slow value got made. He did not sell. He made his contribution that month exactly as he always had, and he went back to the shop the next morning and hooped barrels until his arms ached. By the time his son, Caleb, was old enough to hold a draw knife steady, Thaddeus was teaching him 2 trades at once. The first was how to read the grain of a stave, how to know by the sound of a mallet whether a hoop was seated true. The second was the discipline of the coffee can on the shelf above the workbench, where a portion of every job's payment went before anything else was spent, straight into that same simple, unglamorous fund that owned a sliver of the whole wide, striving country. Caleb was skeptical too, the way sons often are of their father's oldest convictions. He watched the year 2000 come and go, watched the technology companies that everyone in town had been buying stock in, on hot tips collapse into nothing, wiping out neighbors who had gotten greedy and chased what was shiny instead of what was sound. Thaddeus's own account fell as well, because it held a little of everything, the sensible alongside the foolish. But it never held only the foolish. It recovered slowly, the way oak recovers its shape after steaming. Caleb watched his father add to the account anyway, every single month, through headlines that said the market was broken forever. The barrels kept going out the shop door, the distillery kept aging its whiskey in the dark, and the fund kept quietly, unglamorously growing, the way a tree grows, which is to say too slowly for anyone to see it happening, and too surely for anyone to stop it. In 2008, Thaddeus was 66 years old, grey-headed, still working, when the housing markets of the whole country came apart at the seams. This time, it was Caleb's turn to feel his stomach drop, because Caleb had his own family now, his own coffee can, his own account grown large enough that the falling numbers meant something real. He drove out to his father's shop and found the old man exactly where he always was, bent over a barrel, draw knife in hand. Thaddeus did not look up from his work. He said only that a barrel under pressure is supposed to groan. That's how you know the hoops are doing their job. He told Caleb that panic was the one thing a cooper could never afford. Not with fire, not with pressure, not with money. Caleb went home and didn't touch his account. Neither of them sold a single share. By 2020, Thaddeus Merrick was 78 years old and had finally, reluctantly, handed the shop over to Caleb and to Caleb's own daughter, Nora, who had grown up sanding staves under both their watchful eyes. When the whole world shut its doors that spring, when the distillery itself went quiet for the first time in 100 years, Nora asked her grandfather, over the phone, whether this was finally the crash that proved him wrong. Thaddeus laughed, a dry, warm laugh, and told her that every single crash of his lifetime had fell in the moment, like the one that would prove him wrong. 1987 felt that way, 2000 felt that way, 2008 felt that way, and every single time the fear had been a liar and the patience had been the truth. He told her, the barrel does not care how loud the world is shouting outside the rickhouse door. It only cares about time and darkness and being left alone to do its quiet work. Nora kept her contributions going that year, the way her father and grandfather had taught her, even though she was afraid, even though half the town was afraid, and true to the pattern that had Thaddeus Merrick died in the spring of 2024 at the age of 82, in the same small house he had lived in for 60 years, with sawdust still faintly on his boots from a barrel he had helped Nora finish the week before. He had never once, in 51 years, described himself as an investor. He had described himself, until his very last day, simply as a cooper. Held for over half a century, the fear passed, and the slow work resumed. It was only after his passing that Caleb and Nora sat down with the accountant to settle his affairs and learned what 51 years of unglamorous, monthly unshaken patience had actually built. The number on the page did not look like it belonged to a man who had spent his whole life smelling of char smoke and oak shavings. It looked like the fortune of a banker. Though Thaddeus had never once worn a suit that wasn't for a funeral, he had left careful instructions. A portion for Caleb, a portion for Nora. Enough that neither would ever have to worry the way their father once had over a single bad harvest of orders. And the rest, the largest portion of all, was left to build a trade school in Millhaven, one that would teach coopering and carpentry and the old patient handcrafts to any young person in the county who wanted to learn a trade with their hands, free of charge, forever. The old shop on Foundry Street was torn down that autumn, its grey stones numbered and set aside, its tin roof lifted whole and laid atop the new building rising in its place, so that hair would still ring against something Thaddeus had once stood beneath. At the ribbon cutting, Nora stood where her grandfather's shop had once stood, in front of a building with his name carved into a beam of white oak above the door, and she told the gathered town the same thing he had told her on the phone in the spring of 2020. She said that everyone had waited for the crash that would finally prove him wrong. It never came. Not because the crashes weren't real, and not because the fear wasn't real, but because a barrel takes years to become worth opening. It is charred and sealed and left alone through storms it cannot control and seasons it cannot rush. Thaddeus Merrick understood, better than most men who spend their lives in front of a stock ticker, that wealth is built the very same way, not by watching it, not by touching it, but by trusting the process enough to leave it sealed, and letting time, slow and stubborn and entirely unglamorous, finish the work that patience always finishes, for those willing to wait for it. Underneath all of it, quietly in the dark, something was still being made.